Amma ba'd. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For the last many weeks we have been discussing the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam regarding the nature of Islamic teachings, regarding how we should have our intention before we perform an act of worship, how to purify that intention, avoid showing off, and to make sure that whatever good deeds that we do, they have an effect for our worldly well-being and our spiritual well-being. And now I would like to begin our look at some of the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam which refer to issues of fiqh and practice. And in these ahadith, a good number of the traditions, they deal specifically with the rulings of Islamic law. What is obligatory, what is necessary for us to know, and what is not. And that aspect of these ahadith is something which is the topic of a separate session, Islamic law. And in that, it is more important to look at the conclusions that are derived from the Quranic verses and from the ahadith, and not at each individual hadith. That might not actually make a question easier to resolve. It might make it something that raises more questions than it can solve. But there are some ahadith that I think it is good for us to look at, simply to gain an understanding of the environment that our Imams lived in, the environment of questions and answers that existed in their time. So we gain a little bit of an appreciation about some of those rulings which our Imams taught. So we don't look at fiqh simply as a series of rulings in a book of law, but as something that was actually lived and taught by the Imams with a certain perspective. And that perspective is something that we need to be able to learn and maintain. Now, the first chapter of fiqh in general is Kitab al-Tahara, purification. And this is an important part of our lives as Muslims. Our purpose in life is prayer, is worship. And worship is facilitated by the ritual prayers and the mention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we do, and by the recitation of Quran. And those ritual acts of worship, there are two types of taharat that are required. There is the physical taharat, or purity, which means that our bodies and our clothes, our person, not be impure. We cannot pray if we are impure. And similarly, we can't touch the text of the Quran or put our hand to the Quran if physically we are impure. And also, in order to touch the text of the Quran or to recite a ritual prayer, we have to have a state of tahara, which is not physical, but which comes by having performed wudu or ghusl, as may be obligatory. So this is something which Islam, it teaches and it encourages us to maintain that state of tahara as frequently as possible. There are many of us who think of being pure or being tahir, both in that physical sense and in that spiritual sense of having wudu, as something which is an obligation for prayer or which is an obligation for certain acts of worship, like tawaf, for example. But Islam recommends for us to look at purity as something that we should try to maintain throughout our lives, especially being in a state of wudu, being in a state where we are able to touch the text of Quran if we may wish to. We are able to recite a recommended prayer or a wajib prayer immediately if the need enters into our life or if the thought enters into our life. We don't have to go and make special ablutions. And so, for example, it is recommended for us to always maintain wudu immediately after our wudu is broken. Whether it be by sleep or by any other means, if our state of wudu is broken, then it is recommended for us not to wait until the next prayer, but to immediately enter into a state of wudu. And another example is that it is recommended for us to make that state of wudu before we go to sleep. Even if we know that we are not going to pray, even if we know that we are not going to be needing that wudu for anything that we do, but before we go to sleep, we should be in a state of wudu. And we have in a hadith that doing so ensures that we will be in a state of dhikr and worship even while we are asleep. And to make it easier for us, Sharia has also told us that sometimes we remember that we're supposed to do wudu after we have already gone to bed, after we have already laid down. And Islam does not even trouble us to have to get up and go to the sink and do wudu. If while we have already laid down, if we make the intention and do tayammum according to the proper conditions, then that will count for the taharat and give us the thawab and the reward of dhikr for as long as we are asleep. So that sleep will be a blessed sleep. A third example is that if a person is junub and they are not immediately able to do ghusl, then it is recommended for them before they go to sleep, or if they want to eat or drink something, if they cannot do ghusl, to at the very least do wudu, and that will take away the state of karaha or reprehensibility of sleeping or eating. So this spiritual state is something that we should seek to maintain even when it is not a question of a wajib prayer or an obligation that we have or tawaf that we might be doing. And the same thing applies to our physical state. Now there are certain pitfalls that do enter into these teachings. This is something which is recommended in Islam, but the immediate pitfall, which many of us may have experienced or we may know people who have experienced, is that it can lead to a person developing waswas, which is a state of constant doubts, constant worry about whether we are pure. So every time we leave the house, if it is raining, for example, then we feel we have become najis. Every time we enter into a public place, we feel that we have become najis. If we are around a young child, then we feel that we have become najis, or our house or our environment that might have become najis. And this is a very common problem, but it is not a state of extra caution or extra religiosity. In fact, in Islam, it is a very disliked and a very reprehensible state, and we have a hadith that say that this is from shaitan. The purpose of that Islamic recommendation to maintain the state of purity and that state of cleanliness, that is to facilitate worship, to facilitate a healthy lifestyle and a healthy mindset for the believer. Not to become an end in itself and not to distract us or prevent us from leading constructive lives. So our Imams, they have criticized that state of extra caution or extra precaution. There is a hadith that is narrated from Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, that when he would go to the restroom, he would actually splash himself with some drops of water before he would enter into the restroom. And the reason that he would do that is so that if there would be splashes or drops of water when he left, then his mind would not be preoccupied with whether that water is tahir or not, whether it is pak or not. The doubt may come, and then even if a person knows what the religious ruling is, they might still be preoccupied and they might subconsciously think that my clothes are not clean. So the Imam would actually take proactive steps, and he would splash water ahead of time so that even that thought would not enter the mind and a person would not be distracted from their life. Of course, the Islamic ruling in a similar state is that whenever we have no firm reason to believe that water is impure, if we don't have proof that something is impure, then we are to assume that it is pure. And in some cases, if our mind may be prone to being overly cautious or doubtful, then we should take those steps to prevent that doubt from entering into our mind. So it doesn't distract us, it doesn't prevent us from leading a constructive life. There is a hadith from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, and this is a very well